Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth part in our five-part series, Your Data, Your Way. We're going to be walking through and showing you how to configure and control your data flows. And then at the end, we'll kind of take everything that we talked about over the course of the last 5 webinars and show you some more complex scenarios that you can hook up if using Hull. So hi, my name is Tim. I'm the head of product here at Hull.
And I'm Michał. I'm a product owner, mostly overseeing the connectors development. We'll see first today, so I'll be able to maybe show you them in more details today.
All right, so we're going to start with a quick intro to Hull, and then we'll move on to talking about segmentation. It's a feature that many of our customers use and love. We'll get into a little bit more details on how to do some more advanced things and kind of talk about the basic concepts that allow segmentation to put you in the driver's seat of your whole data flow. And then we'll talk about a couple more advanced use cases where we'll talk about one-way synchronization as well as bi-directional synchronization as well.
Okay, so let's start with some high-level overview, just in case you don't know Hull very well yet. So we are a B2B customer data platform, and during this webinar session, we showed you those 3 steps, how we allow you to unify your data sources in order to build a unified user profile. Then we showed you a couple of tools, how to cleanse, transform, and segment data, and all of that allows you using our platform to sync and activate data to create personalized experience. So Hull is not only about creating and stitching together those unified profiles, but also about activating that data. So as I mentioned, we covered those 2 first points till now in the previous webinars, and today we'll focus on syncing and activating users' data. So I wanted to start by showing you how such unified profile looks like. It's key that you understand what are the key concepts inside Hull, because we will heavily rely on that information and that knowledge during the whole webinar. So let me share my screen and I will show you how Hull dashboard looks like. Okay, so I'm inside a Hull organization with a list of users. I will search for a user on my list. So I have one sample user over here with his profile being stitched together from multiple sources and services. On the left side in the table, we see all the attributes coming from those linked services. So I have an enrichment tool, CS tool, a CRM tool. I have just a bunch of properties and fields being fetched, but I could have more precise data coming in based on my setup. But these are all fields and properties coming from the profiles of that same person across multiple tools. If I scroll back to the top on the right side, I see a timeline of activities or events. We call them user events, and these are activities related to the user or performed by the user. At the top, we see email sent, for instance, or email open. So you can see this is an activity related to the user. Service send an email to an individual, but then there is an action performed actually by the user. So these are the 2 key elements: user attributes and user events. We have also accounts. User can be linked to an account, and these profiles are pretty similar. Events are on the user level. Accounts can be linked to users. So that would be a quick introduction to core concepts inside Hull. Getting back to the slides, we wanted to tell you today how you can actually start breaking down data silos, and that means how to get in sync across different services. We have shown you how the unified profile looks like, but in order to be able to start syncing the data between different services, you need full configurability over your data flows. And that's how, and it will show you how we achieve that inside Hull and using our key component called segmentation today. There are obviously some other ways how to achieve that. We know that some of our customers are using data warehouse to pipe first all the CRM or CS or product data, and then use some reverse ETL to bring some data points back, or they use workflow tools. But there are certain challenges using those techniques. The first one could be lack of flexibility, especially in context of workflow tools, where you have little or even no control over which fields or users are being synced, because at the time you are looking only on one user, and it's hard to build more complex filtering, for instance, because you cannot look into related entities. That, as a result, can lead to data pollution in connected systems, that you don't have a good control, and you cannot be very precise in which users and which accounts or events you are syncing across between different systems. The second issue and challenge we observe is latency, especially if you go with this path of using data warehouse, where possibly you can use more complex queries and be more precise on what data you're seeing, and you can perform some aggregations, and you can do more filtering using complex queries. But usually those tools have a long interval between which you can sync actually the data. We saw a couple of customers coming in and being surprised that we can do quicker than 24 hours or once a day. And that obviously it's a huge limitation when you want to build near real-time campaigns or perform some immediate actions based on data being synced or being changed in selected tools. So these are the challenges that we were observing when working with our customers, and we wanted to show you how we address them today. So I'll leave it up to Tim to talk more about how our segmentation tool works.
Yeah, so one of the primary concepts and features of Hull is called Hull segments. So a Hull segment is a way to break down your users and your accounts into smaller groups where you can personalize specific messages to those groups. We've talked a bit about it throughout the series. We're going to talk specifically how it works today and show you exactly how to trigger based off of these segments. Segmentation is the tool that really puts you in the driver's seat of your data flows in Hull. So a segment is built based off of all of the data that you've accumulated within Hull. So you've got user attributes, you've got user behaviors, you've got account attributes as well. So you're using all of the attributes and behaviors from all of the different services. Maybe they're browsing your website, maybe you've enriched the data a little bit, maybe your salespeople have put in data in the CRM, maybe they're already trialing your software and they've hit a few things that maybe you can help them with, or they've gotten to a couple points where maybe it's time to sell them a higher plan. So I think it's really important to talk about why segmentation is important to do in real time. So when you think about it, a segment is essentially a query. It's a query on top of your data. It says if your title is this, if you've done this, if you've done this, interacted this way in the last X number of days, show me the list of people that have done that. And so the first step is really about identifying people with a propensity to buy, or with a that are at a point in your funnel where you can push them to the next step, push them to a salesperson or into a more personalized email campaign, and it effectively helps you drive more sales. So that pretty much makes sense as far as the query goes. You're finding interesting people. Maybe you want to target them next time, or you want to give that list to your salespeople. But what really makes a real-time segment powerful is managing the membership of that segment going forward. And so what I mean by that is essentially you have this query of interesting people. That's great. What really drives the automation is when somebody conforms to all of those behaviors, an hour from now, when you're not looking at it, and you may want to, that they entered into that segment, and you want to trigger based off of that entrance into that segment. And so the way that we calculate segments, we calculate it based off of any kind of data change. So they do something, an attribute changes, they could be moving into that segment. And so that membership creates an opportunity for you to trigger and automate some of your workflows. And we'll show you how to do that in a second. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to split this into two separate demos, one around triggering a one-way sync, more like a notification when something happens, when someone enters into a segment. And then we're going to go with a more complex case where we're going to be triggering off a segment, we're going to be routing stuff back into unified attributes, and then we're going to be synchronizing that across all of your tools.
Okay, so I'll start with the first part of the demo. I'll do a simpler one-way syncing. Let me share my screen and get back to Hull dashboard again. So I'll get back to the users list and show you a very basic usage for the segmentation tool. I won't go too deep because that's not the purpose of today's webinar, but I will give you I think, pretty good taste and understanding how powerful this tool is. So I will pick an attribute that I would like to query on. So I will pick something from our enrichment tool, and there is this employment seniority attribute, for instance. There are obviously multiple data points coming in, but that's one, let's say, it's important or interesting for us seeing people who fulfill certain criteria here. So I can start training my query and seeing which users are fulfilling these criteria. As we can see, we already have a bunch of users here. And then I can add as many as attribute as I want, or I can start querying events as well. So this is where our segmentation tool allows you to query data points coming from different services or data points stored as either attributes or events related to either some state of a user profile or activities certain user performed. So I will, for instance, search for users who visited our page, but also I can drill down into the event properties and go as deep as checking if a certain page was visited. So I'll search for people who visited the pricing page. I get, some interesting results here. And obviously I can go further than that. I can add more events, more attributes. I can also pick attributes from other services. Doesn't limit me in any way. So I can go to a CRM, pick any data points from here. I can go to the accounts level as well. So I can read company data that particular user is linked to, or I can also query unified attributes that I believe Tim will show you later. Obviously, we can play with more complex queries here. I can add groups of criteria. I can change the operators from and, meaning all the following filters needs to be fulfilled, or I can go with or. So I hope you already see how powerful that tool can be. But as Tim mentioned, where the place where that segmentation drives the data automation is after we save the segment and that information becomes something that's populated to the user profile. So if I hit save and call those people in interesting leads, for instance, and I'll save that segment, I can find it on the segments list, interesting leads. And if I open up one of those profiles, that would be, by the way, the first profile I have shown you, we can see it in the segments list. So that information is a list of user, but it's also a tag on the user profile. And that tag is something we can now use in a connector that will allow us to perform any actions or activate that data. So as we said, it could be valuable for us to now notify certain people from our team if people start to enter that segment and start to fulfill those criteria. For that, I installed a Slack connector in my connectors list, and I will show you how you can set up the connector to start notifying people about people entering that segment, your website visitors, for instance. First, I needed to connect the Slack, as most of our connectors need some kind of authorization. And then I scroll down to the Slack user notification triggers section, where I can specify exact triggering setup or exact triggering logic, which I can have multiple of those triggers in each connector, but I will start with the first one. So I selected one of the built-in triggers, which is entered user segment. So every time the user starts to fulfill after any change or activity, fulfill those conditions, I will perform the trigger. I select which segments we are talking about. I could pick any of my segments, and then I specify what's the resulting action. So I define which channel it goes to or a user. For the demo purpose, I selected myself, and I can write the message. I started with something very basic here, but you can use any of the user attributes over here to customize the message you are sending. So if I save that setting and I will see more user starting to enter the segment, I will see notifications appearing. I just wanted to show you really what's the end result. This is my Slack personal channel, and you can see below here my testing user triggered a message earlier today with the message I have specified and the email address being replaced. So you can imagine using it for pinging people in your sales channel, or you can use the left user segment for instance, customer success use cases where you have a segment of people or accounts that you consider healthy from the product standpoint. And if people start to leave that segment, that may be an important signal for your CSMs, and you want to notify them in a channel, meaning that the user is leaving that segment. There is maybe an issue, and they should proactively reach out to certain customers. So that would be using our ready out-of-the-box integration with a selected service. Let's now consider a slightly more advanced scenario where we don't have a direct or dedicated connector. And one example of such case could be your backend data, or sorry, your backend system, or some more complex integrations. For that, we have a connector called Outgoing Webhooks that's able to trigger any generic outgoing webhook. It can be either triggering, as I mentioned, your backend system or some custom scripts, or it can go to the data warehouse, for instance, if we don't support that certain DB system, and it performs those queries in real time. You start configuration of that connector by pasting in a webhook URL. I used an external service that allows me to preview the results here. So I pasted the endpoint, and every time the criteria are met, the connector will send a specific payload to that endpoint. I can specify more technical stuff here, since this is more technical connector. I can tell how often or on which at which concurrency level it should operate. Then below, I have a similar set of settings. It starts with a pretty general global filter. So I can specify, for instance, free trial users. The scenario where I was thinking here is that I have people who trial my product, and if they perform certain action, I would like to trigger some kind of sequence of actions, either in the product for them inside the trial to show more options, or to trigger some notifications, either inside the product or through email. I could use a connector such as Customer IO, but let's say for the purpose of this demo, I need to ping my backend data, but I want to keep my logic inside Hull. So I specified the segment in a similar way as I did the previous one. And then in the triggers section, I can specify what are the exact triggers that will cause the connector to ping the selected URL. So I selected an event. The user created a segment in the free trial. So every time that event happens on the user profile, the connector will hit. So I can go now to see in that external service, which is pretty technical, how that looks like. So as you can see, I have some HTTP requests being made before, and in the request body, we can see what was sent by the connector. So it contains all the data points, all the attributes from the user, and that's something you can even customize further because we expose you a code editor where you can specify what's the exact body that the connector will be sending out. That way you can adapt your flow and those HTTP requests to any tool, no matter if you have direct control over it or not. Usually what we encounter here is that certain infrastructural parts are owned by the technical team, and their timelines may not be adjusted to your go-to-market teams. So it may be easier to have direct control on how you send the data, because maybe the changes on the other side are not possible in the timeline that's sufficient for you. So these were the two cases of how we can activate the segment, and the segment becomes a trigger to ping and perform some specific real-time actions.
All right, so the next scenario that we're going to show you is a scenario involving synchronizing data to Salesforce as well as synchronizing data back from Salesforce. And then we'll also show you how to unify the attributes in the middle automatically. So I'm going to share different screen. So this can be a pretty complex scenario. So I captured a bunch of different tabs with all of the different states that we're in so that you can see all of the data as it changes. I'm going to be using this user that we created at the very first webinar. You can see all of his browsing history. You can see his email history. We've kind of merged him over time. You can see when he created an account on the website, and then you can see all of his demographic data from your trial and maybe a submission from Livestorm. So we've got a lot of data here that we can trigger off of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this unified title. We talked a little bit about unifying data and standardizing it a couple webinars ago. And so now that I have this unified title, a good title that's based off of several other data points, I'm going to want to push that data somewhere. So I may not want to push all of these people, though, in all of these cases. So what I might do instead is, like we said before, maybe I want to push not just people with a unified title, but people who have done something specifically. So for example, I want to find everybody who's looked at the website who has a page event, but not just looked at the website necessarily, maybe something that indicates buying behavior, maybe looked at our pricing page. So that's a couple people. This is okay, and then maybe we've opened an email as well. This is all mocked up data. Okay, where maybe I opened a particular campaign. It's a little weird. I think maybe the data may have changed and it recalculated. Here we go. All right, so now what I have is a list of very specific people who I know have a unified title, have looked at the pricing page, and have opened an email from a particular email campaign. You could see me and Angela, and you can see all of the data points, for example, for our title across all of the systems. So you can see that Angela has a couple different job titles based off of what she's submitted in Livestorm, based off of what's in Salesforce. Maybe a Salesforce SDR was putting in something specific, or maybe someone in marketing was putting something into the HubSpot job title. But ultimately, what we do is we take all of these data points and we choose a winner in the unified title. And we talked a little bit about that last time. There's a couple different strategies for doing it. The one that's most straightforward is unification by priority. So what we do is we say, if there's a Salesforce title, take that one. If not, take the HubSpot one. If not, take the Clearbit one. So in this case, if there's 3 different titles, what we're going to do is we're going to take, I think, the Salesforce one, which is the one where we have a unified title. In my case, where we only have a submission via Livestorm, we're going to take that one. So product guy was what I submitted over Livestorm for a particular webinar. So now that I've saved that segment as good leads for the sales team, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to say, any time that somebody enters this segment going forward, I want to push them to the sales team. This is great in terms of knowing, are these people really people that are valuable? You can look and confirm in the past so that in the future you can trigger future leads to go to Salesforce. And so here in the Salesforce connector, we look at the sending leads to Salesforce section, and we say we want to send that segment in particular, anyone who enters it, into Salesforce. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to send their first name, their last name, their title, and their company. And so here's the view in Salesforce where we see my user coming in. We see the company, the unified title, and the email as well. So once it's in Salesforce, you could see a little bit before where there was no job title in Salesforce. This was at the point at which it didn't exist in Salesforce. Once we've sent it to Salesforce and it's there, we then pull that data back in, and the data from Salesforce will show up here. So this situation is in particular is why we like to separate the unified data from the data that's actually in the systems. The data that's in the systems is the raw data. It's the data that resides there at any point in time. So now that we've pushed it to Salesforce, we see that all of these things are unified. They're all the same. Well, now say your salesperson is in Salesforce looking at, Tim, and he says, this product guy title, this doesn't seem right. I'm going to go on LinkedIn and see what his real title is. He finds out, real title is head of product. He changes it to head of product. And now what happens is that head of product, we pull on a 5-minute schedule for Salesforce. That head of product will be pulled back into Hull. And this is sort of the key moment right here, based to unifying data both ways. So here we see that the head of product is pulled back into Hull. And what that means is that this unified title needs to be recalculated. So I captured this tab right at the moment that the head of product field came back into Hull before we had recomputed the unified title. So what happens is, based off of this change in this field, we are actually moments later recalculating that actually, the Salesforce one is the best based off of, we know that it's our source of truth. We know that probably if there was a salesperson in there changing things, it's a better data point than, say, for example, what someone submitted over Livestorm. So this is our source of truth, and it actually propagates as a higher priority field back into my unified title. And then ultimately, this is what the data will eventually look like once it's been fully recalculated, where the Salesforce lead title is the highest priority in deciding what the unified title is. And then as you kind of build different attributes into this unified group, that's how you start to synchronize a lot of different types of attributes to your different systems based off of what all of the other systems were saying. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Like we were showing you here before, we can actually use a quorum strategy where if you have 3 or more systems, we can say, well, is 50%, over 50% of the system saying a certain value, then set the attribute to be that particular value. We see that priority most of the time is what people want and need. There are a couple other edge cases here too, certainly in bidirectional sync where, if somebody is changing the job title in HubSpot, perhaps that's the one actually that should be the unified title because that's the latest change that has been made. And so that's also another strategy for unifying where you can take the latest change from any given system and say that's the one that is the highest priority because that's the one that has been the latest changed. That one's a little bit more complicated because you can introduce loops if two people are sort of fighting over the job title in two different systems. We don't see that as often, but if you have the people process in the background to know kind of whose job it is to make certain changes, then that way works as well. Right. So we talked about using Hull segments to drive automation in Hull. And then we talked about one-way sync using notifications to systems like Slack or any given system with outgoing webhooks. And then we talked about really flexible bi-directional synchronization with services like Salesforce. So thank you for tuning in to our webinar series, Your Data, Your Way. You can catch all of the replays of all the webinars on our blog. We really appreciate your time and thank you for listening.